From the very first time you opened a basic physics textbook, you were programmed to believe in absolute truth. You were told that the space out there is a perfect vacuum. A massive, endless grave lacking the physical particles required to transmit vibration. This implies that the universe is completely mute. Even if a hypernova detonates and tears an entire constellation apart right in front of your eyes, you would only witness a blinding flash of light in absolute silence. Just before the thermal radiation turns you into dust, there is no explosion, there is no echo. On the surface, this is a deeply comforting scientific theorem. It tells us that in the ultimate depths of destruction, the cosmos maintains a peaceful, voiceless calm. But that is a lie. Or at least, it is a sophisticated cover-up hiding the severe limitations of human perception. Things are still screaming out there. You just have not tuned into the correct frequency to hear them. Let us go back to April of 2004. The automated probe known as Cassini, a metallic shell packed with billions of dollars worth of cutting-edge microchips, began its final plunge into the orbit of the planet with the largest ring system in our solar system. Outside the titanium hull, the temperature was hundreds of degrees below zero. The spacecraft was gliding through a thick, heavy darkness. Everything seemed to obey that absolute theorem of silence. That was until the radio and plasma wave sensor membrane attached to the side of the ship started vibrating violently. This was not a physical collision with space debris. It was a vicious disturbance in the electromagnetic spectrum. That lifeless machine was suddenly surrounded by an invisible storm of data. When that encrypted data was beamed back to Earth, piercing through hundreds of millions of kilometers of empty space, the specialists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory performed a routine technical procedure. They translated those radio frequencies into acoustic waves. It is a standard method used to analyze plasma density. The tape was played back through the studio monitors in a dead silent control room. In that exact moment, heavy brows furrowed. Cold sweat began to form on the foreheads of veteran astrophysicists. The sound tearing at their eardrums did not resemble the random hiss of a solar flare. It did not sound like the steady, low growl of a gas giant. It was a rhythmic chaos. High-pitched shrieks intertwined with sudden gasps, long trembling echoes, and then a suffocating, abrupt silence. It was relentless. It felt entirely intentional. If you close your eyes and listen to the raw audio, you do not picture stray electrons crashing into a magnetic field. You picture a colossal, lightless pit where millions of entities are trapped together, trampling over one another, screaming in absolute, synchronized panic, a symphony of pure torment. What you are about to hear will force you to reconsider the boundaries of biology and physics. You will see how modern science stumbles and stammers when confronted with these buried audio files. And you will realize the horrifying truth that whatever is howling between those rings might never have been just lifeless rocks. Let us dissect the first layer of this anomaly, the nightmare symphony and the logical scratch in the scientific consensus. Look at the rings of Saturn through any color-corrected photograph released to the public. You see majesty and elegance, a glowing crown forged from light and ice surrounding a pale yellow sphere. That is the perspective from a safe, untouchable distance. But if I were to throw you right into the middle of that ring, the romantic illusion would shatter instantly. Surrounding you are billions of jagged, dirty ice blocks. Some are the size of a grain of sand, while others are massive monoliths the size of the Himalayas. They are all spinning in a furious, chaotic orbit at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. It is a giant, endless meat grinder. They smash into each other, shatter into dust, and then fuse back together under the immense crushing weight of gravity. Theoretically, the astronomical community explains that the sounds recorded by the probe are simply the result of this violent environment tearing the fabric of space apart. When micrometeors and ice dust collide, they generate a cloud of electrostatic plasma. The energy waves from this plasma environment interact with the massive magnetic field lines of the planet, producing radio emissions. Particles hit the magnetic field, become radio waves, and when we pitch them down to a human hearing range, it creates the auditory illusion of a scream. A neat, tidy explanation. It completely shuts the door on any further questioning. The event is neatly filed away as an interesting natural phenomenon. However, an investigative mind cannot stop at the surface of a polished report. When independent audio engineers isolated the spectral waveform of that specific recording, they noticed a terrifying asymmetry. Every known emission phenomenon in nature, whether it is a lightning storm or a solar wind, generates white noise frequencies. It is chaotic, random, and lacks any repeating structure. It sounds like a television tuned to a dead channel. Yet, the scream from those rings possesses a highly specific vocal range and amplitude. It has a distinct starting point, a climax, and deliberate pauses. Even more disturbing, when you place its waveform right next to the acoustic graph of a human being enduring severe psychological torture. The asymptotic lines match up. It is a chilling, perfect overlap. Why would a cluster of dead matter choose to mimic the exact acoustic signature of biological pain? This alignment is not just a statistical error. It is a breadcrumb leading us to a much darker territory. The frozen graveyard located within the B-ring. A place where sunlight is completely drained away, and the magnetic pressure reaches a level of pure insanity. To truly grasp the horror of what is happening inside the B-ring, we must first tear down a fundamental bias embedded in human biology. A psychological blind spot that astrobiologists refer to as carbon chauvinism. For decades, researchers like Carl Sagan and modern scientists have scoured the cosmos looking for liquid water, moderate temperatures, and oxygen. We look for reflections of our own fragile existence. We assume that life, in order to be considered life, must be built from the same wet, squishy carbon-based building blocks that we are. We demand that aliens bleed. What if consciousness does not require a physical vessel of flesh and bone? Venture back into the extreme, hostile environment of a gas giant. The atmospheric pressure near the core of Saturn could crush a military-grade titanium submarine into a microscopic speck in a fraction of a second. The magnetic storms raging across its equator span hundreds of thousands of kilometers, whipping up electrical currents that would vaporize our entire planet's power grid instantly. In this cauldron of extreme physics, matter stops behaving according to the rules of a high school chemistry textbook. Atoms are violently stripped of their electrons. The result is plasma, a highly conductive, hyper-volatile soup of charged particles interacting with raw magnetic force. For years, rogue theoretical physicists have whispered in closed-door symposiums about the mathematical probability of complex, self-organizing plasma structures. They hypothesize the existence of entities made entirely of electromagnetic energy. Inorganic life forms. They would not consume water or harvest sunlight. They would sustain their existence by feeding on static electricity and the friction generated by magnetic fields. They would be invisible to an optical camera lens, but blindingly bright to the delicate antennas of the radio and plasma wave science instrument on board the Cassini orbiter. Now, take that theoretical framework and drag it into the chaotic, grinding abyss of Saturn's rings. If such plasma-based entities do exist, the dense, icy expanse of the rings is not a sanctuary. It is a slaughterhouse. The gravitational pull of the massive gas giant is relentlessly dragging trillions of ice meteors into a never-ending collision course. Imagine mountains of frozen ammonia and dirty water ice, jagged and razor-sharp, crashing into each other at orbital velocities. The physical friction between these colossal ice mountains generates the immense static charge that these plasma entities need to feed on. They are drawn to the rings for sustenance. But it is a deadly trap. The physical collisions of the rocks are constantly tearing their delicate electromagnetic fields apart. Listen again to the audio captured by the probe. That high-pitched, rhythmic squealing, the sudden, desperate gasps. It is not the acoustic illusion of ice breaking in a vacuum. It is the sound of an energy-based ecosystem being systematically ground down. They are being sheared in half by physical rocks. Their energy matrices violently dispersed. And they are begging for release. They are screaming because they are being flayed alive by the unrelenting laws of orbital mechanics. A perpetual cycle of feeding and being torn apart in the dark. When the raw telemetry data first hit the servers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the reaction was not scientific excitement. It was a profound, suffocating dread. You do not need a degree in astrophysics to recognize the sound of absolute agony. The official stance from the space agency, however, was predictably sterile and heavily controlled. They quickly released a public statement labeling the terrifying audio as Saturn kilometric radiation. A dry, unthreatening scientific term designed to put the public back to sleep. The phenomenon was officially classified as random radio emissions caused by planetary magnetic fields interacting with solar winds. Case closed. Move along. The engineers who initially monitored the live feed, the ones who heard the raw, uncompressed shrieks echoing through their studio monitors, were quietly reassigned to other projects. The data was heavily filtered, pitched down, and sanitized before it was ever uploaded to public educational platforms. They tried to bury the human reaction to the trauma. But information, much like the plasma trapped in the rains, has a way of leaking out of its containment. Several independent acousticians, operating outside the strict jurisdiction of government non-disclosure agreements, managed to secure copies of the original, uncompressed audio files. What they discovered when they ran the data through advanced spectral analysis software completely shattered the natural phenomenon excuse. The spectral graphs did not show the chaotic, jagged spikes typical of a natural solar storm. Instead, they revealed a highly structured, almost architectural pattern of frequencies. It was not just noise. It was syntax. There were distinct clusters of audio data that repeated at precise mathematical intervals. Specifically, intervals aligning with the golden ratio, a mathematical signature found in the spiral of galaxies, the arrangement of leaves, and the architecture of conscious design. Why would a supposedly lifeless plasma storm, a byproduct of grinding rocks, cry out in the universal language of geometry? This is where the psychological horror truly sets in. The implication is that these energy-based entities possess a collective consciousness. They are acutely aware of their own perpetual destruction. When a jagged ice boulder the size of Manhattan plows through their delicate electromagnetic field at 60,000 km per hour, they do not simply dissipate like a cloud of gas. They feel the agonizing shearing of their matrix. Their structural integrity is violently ripped apart. And they scream, a synchronized chorus of millions of formless entities, trapped in the crushing gravitational well of the gas giant, broadcasting their absolute despair into the void. Think about the staggering scale of this tragedy. For over 4 billion years, our solar system has quietly harbored this invisible slaughterhouse. While humanity was busy discovering fire, building empires, and looking up at the sky with romantic wonder, an entire ecosystem of light and raw energy was being systematically pulverized in the dark. We looked through our telescope lenses, saw a serene, beautiful jewel surrounded by glowing rings, and wrote poetry about it. We were unknowingly staring directly into a cosmic torture chamber. It is quietly rumored within the astronomical community that several veteran researchers who worked directly on decoding the uncompressed data took early, abrupt retirements shortly after the Cassini mission concluded. They stopped giving public lectures. They stopped looking through ocular lenses. Because once you fully comprehend what that protective vacuum of space is actually hiding, the night sky ceases to be a canvas of endless possibilities. It becomes an active crime scene. Right now, you are sitting in a comfortable room. You are breathing a stable mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. You are shielded by a thick, heavy atmospheric dome. You feel grounded. You feel safe. But remember that out there, just beyond the thin protective shell of our fragile blue marble, the grinding has not stopped. The violent collisions are still happening every single second. The shrieks are still echoing through the frozen dust. We just lack the biological hardware to hear them. And perhaps, that evolutionary deafness is the universe's greatest mercy. If the thought of an invisible, screaming cosmos makes you hesitate before looking up at the stars tonight, you are not alone in the dark. There are dozens of other classified audio files and buried anomalies still waiting to be dragged out into the light. If you want to keep peeling back the terrifying, artificial layers of our reality, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because the dark forest is very real. And we are just starting to learn how to listen.